There are 5 core functional networks that I'll mention today in this video. The first one is the Spatial Attention Network. This is anchored on the posterior parietal cortex and also the frontal eye fields. So it's the connections between the posterior parietal cortex, the frontal eye fields, and other parts of the cortex. The Spatial Attention Network is related to different aspects of attention, so goal-directed attention, attending to visual targets that are in our field of view, and it also deals with tracking unexpected stimuli that kind of suddenly come into our field of vision. The next network is the language network, and this is anchored in Wernicke's and Broca's area in the left hemisphere. So it's the connections between Wernicke's and Broca's and also other parts of the cortex. The language network deals with everything related to auditory processing of language, to comprehending sentences, more in Wernicke's area, to actually physically producing language in Broca's area. Notice from previous lectures that this is left lateralized in the majority of cases in the healthy population. But in some cases, especially in left-handed individuals, the language network can be bilaterally represented or even occur in the right hemisphere. The explicit memory network is essentially anchored in the hippocampus, which resides in the medial temporal lobe, so kind of deep down in the middle of the brain. The hippocampus interacts with 2 separate subnetworks that we'll touch on later in this course. This is kind of referred to as the PMAT framework, so the posterior medial section in blue here, and the anterior temporal section in red. Posterior medial really deals with kind of episodic recollections or recollecting really precise types of memories that are personal to you and your experiences. And the red areas or nodes in this graph or network really deal with more semantic type memories. We have a face object recognition network, and this is anchored in mid-temporal and temporal polar cortices. This network helps us as humans detect and recognize other human faces. And more than that, it helps us to detect and recognize non-living objects. It might seem pretty basic to us now, but this is a critical piece of software in our brain to tell apart one face from another and those from non-living objects. So it's a really important network. There's a visual representation of that network as well. The last major functional network is the working memory or executive function network. Simply put, working memory is our ability to hold information in mind for short periods of time and to use and manipulate that information really in a goal-directed way. This also involves attention in a sense because working memory and attention are really highly interdependent. They relate and rely on each other quite a bit. For now, just know that this network is anchored on prefrontal and inferior parietal cortices. Now I want to switch gears a little bit. I've talked about 5 functional networks that are active when we are doing things, but the brain is still active even when we aren't doing anything. Experimentally, we can measure this and test this while participants or patients are being scanned in an MRI machine. The way to do this is simply to tell them to relax and stare at a fixation point on a screen, and other ways not to do anything. And this is what we call a resting state. So you're resting and you're not actively attending to visual stimuli or doing any type of task. And researchers have actually found several resting state networks. The best example of a resting state network as opposed to a functional or task network is the default mode network. This is made up of several areas such as the medial prefrontal cortex, the precuneus, the middle temporal gyrus, and angular gyrus, among a few other regions. And what researchers say with the default mode network is that there was deactivation when participants were engaged in demanding tasks, but then they saw an increase in activation and connectivity when the brain was at rest. So this default mode network really shines when people aren't doing much. Well, as it turns out, the default mode network does play a role in something, because what do you really do, or what do you think people do in a scanner when their only task is to sit there for 15 minutes? Well, they daydream, they engage in types of mind wandering. They plan for things, what they're going to have for dinner tonight, what clothes they're going to wear out to the bar, and more. So the default mode network is involved in autobiographical memory and self-referential processing, or processing in relation to the self, as well as different types of semantic processing. There are other resting state networks, and about 7 that you should be aware of. There's a visual resting state network shown in purple here, and this is mainly in occipital regions and deals with types of visual processing. There's a somatomotor resting state network, and this is shown in blue. These are in the major sensory and motor cortices in the brain, and as you'd imagine, this deals with processing of our sensory systems and motor processing. There are 2 resting state attention networks. The first one is the dorsal attention resting state network, and this is shown in green and includes parietal, occipital, and some frontal regions. The dorsal attention network deals with our voluntary allocation of attention, so the things that we choose to fixate on and then send up for higher processing in the brain. The other network is the ventral attention network. The ventral attention network is shown in kind of a lighter shade of purple here. It's kind of hard to tell apart. It includes temporal, motor, and parietal regions. Compared to the dorsal attention network, the ventral attention network deals with unexpected stimuli and attentional shifts to things that were not previously in our fixated window of attention. The limbic resting state network involves the regions of the brain that are the most ventral or towards the bottom. Among other things, this is involved with self-control, emotion, regulation, and risk-taking. The frontoparietal resting network is shown in orange and involves frontal, parietal, and some temporal regions. This is in part our control network. It interacts with other networks and helps to kind of switch between these other cognitive states and mental processes. The last one shown here in red is the default mode network, and we've already touched on this. So I know I've glossed over these 7 resting state networks. There's a lot more to learn about these, and I really hope that you guys take initiative and to look up some of these networks and what they do. It involves a ton of different brain regions. It's a very active area of research right now. But I just hope that now you're aware of what they are. And again, like I said, you'll be inspired to look these up, learn more about them, and all the really cool research that's being done with resting state networks.